Let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to unpack how a bunch of 16th century theological debates basically and completely accidentally built the modern business world. I mean, if you've ever wondered why our society is just completely obsessed with constant work, productivity, and the daily hustle, you'd probably point the finger at modern capitalism, right? Well, actually, you'd be wrong. The source material we're looking at today, it's this really compelling academic analysis by Pablo Blanco Sarto and Miguel Alfonso Martinez Echeverria, and it reveals a story that is way deeper and way older than capitalism. So why do we view material wealth and productivity as the ultimate signs of success? The answer to this incredibly modern question actually lies about 500 years in the past. We tend to think of management, efficiency, and business ethics as, contemporary inventions, forged in the fires of the Industrial Revolution. But as our source outlines, the foundational blueprint for how we view work, wealth, and practical wisdom today was actually drafted by religious reformers, completely unintentionally. And the really wild part? They were actively trying to solve deeply internal, spiritual problems, not economic ones. To see how we got here, we'll follow a historical domino effect. We'll start by looking at escaping the monastic life, then Luther's radical subjective shift, and the invisible church paradox. From there, we'll cover state power and external work, Calvin's ideas on predestination and prosperity, and finally, the birth of the work ethic. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Escaping the Monastic Life and Bringing Religion to the Everyday. For centuries, the ultimate flex for a serious Christian was literally fleeing the world. I mean, think back to the 4th century. The absolute ideal was the desert hermit, seeking pure Christianity in total solitude. Then, by the 12th and 13th centuries, we get the friars. They represented a kind of renovation, living in communities, sure, but they still remained pretty detached from the everyday world of commerce and politics. Well, the 16th century Protestant Reformation aimed to completely shatter that divide. They wanted to integrate faith directly into family and work. Basically, they wanted to plant the seed of faith right smack in the middle of the noisy, bustling city, instead of keeping it as this elite activity for people who could afford to check out of ordinary society. Moving right along to Section 2, Luther's radical subjective shift, or faith over philosophy. So up until the 16th century, the social order and ethics in general were largely based on something called natural law. This idea drew heavily from Greek and Roman philosophy. It basically assumed that human nature, reason, and custom were good and could reliably guide human behavior. But Martin Luther, he stripped all of that away. His thinking was, if human nature is inherently fallen, how on earth can we trust our own logic? For him, the only valid foundation was sola scriptura. That means relying purely on the subjective illumination of the believer and the literal word of God. He threw out human reason entirely. It was this massive, complete pivot from external, collective wisdom straight to internal, subjective revelation. Not the law, but grace. That was Luther's ultimate guiding principle. And by insisting that divine grace and human law were entirely irreconcilable, Luther inadvertently removed human nature as the foundation of the social order. Our source text notes that he viewed God as so entirely omnipotent that human freedom, reason, and history were, well, basically superfluous. Think about that for a second. Superfluous. Human perfection wasn't something you could progressively work toward through good habits anymore. Nope. It was entirely 100% in God's hands. This brings us to Section 3, the invisible church paradox, and tearing down the hierarchy. Because Luther viewed grace as this entirely internal, subjective experience, he argued that the true church couldn't be an earthly institution at all. It had to be invisible. He called it the hidden church. This is a spiritualistic Protestant concept where the true church is known only to God, based entirely on inner bonds between believers. Think of it like a purely spiritual network, where the only connection that matters is the signal between your personal conscience and the divine. By pushing faith entirely into the inner conscience, he totally stripped away the need for visible structures or hierarchies. To him, visible structures were just prone to corruption and rigid human laws. You can really see the contrast here. The traditional Catholic structure relied on a ministerial priesthood, meaning direct apostolic succession and a visible hierarchy. Luther, on the other hand, championed the common priesthood, the idea that every single baptized believer is a priest. Now, on paper, that is an incredibly democratizing idea, right? It totally decentralizes religion. But by making every person their own ultimate spiritual authority and suppressing the old hierarchy, Luther accidentally removed all the guardrails. I mean, if everyone is their own authority, how do you maintain any kind of social or practical order? And that dilemma leads us right into Section 4, State Power and External Work, and the unintended chaos that followed. As you can probably guess, a society based entirely on invisible, subjective inner face? Yeah, it didn't stay orderly for long. We can actually trace exactly how this unfolded in 4 steps. Step 1, the church focuses purely on the spiritual. Step 2, morality becomes completely subjective, leading to antinomianism, which is basically the rejection of laws. People thought, hey, if human laws don't save my soul, why follow them? Step 3 naturally follows. Social disorder and arbitrariness erupt everywhere. Finally, step 4, Luther quickly realized his purely spiritualized hidden church was practically unviable. So, to stop total anarchy, the secular state had to step in. Luther, ironically, had to hand over control of the church's earthly organization to political princes just to enforce order. As our source text outlines, because this pure spiritual Protestantism was practically unfeasible, it created this massive psychological dualism for the everyday person. On the inside, you had this highly individualistic, subjective inner faith. But on the outside, you had this passive, resigned acceptance of whatever external societal laws the state imposed just to keep the peace. Work, civic duties, daily chores. They weren't a path to personal perfection or joy anymore. They were just things to passively endure in a broken world. Practical wisdom essentially vanished from the public sphere, replaced by sheer, gritty endurance. Enter Section 5, Calvin's predestination and prosperity, creating a new discipline. So John Calvin steps onto the scene, and he's facing a population completely gripped by the psychological anxiety of Luther's subjective faith. Because if everything is internal, how do you ever really know you're saved? Calvin's solution was predestination. This is the theological idea that personal salvation or condemnation is decided by an unappealable, inevitable fate, totally independent of human freedom or choices. It's the ultimate cosmic spoiler alert. You're either irreversibly chosen or you're not. It sounds incredibly harsh, I know, but practically, it actually relieved a lot of anxiety. If the decision is already made before you're even born, you don't have to worry about constantly earning your spot. This triggered a massive 180-degree shift. Luther's approach was all about passive abandonment to God inside the conscience. But Calvin's approach, it was all about active energy deployed to implement Christ's kingdom on earth. Calvin basically transformed Luther's mystical passivity into strict, worldly militancy. Instead of just hiding inside their own consciences and enduring the state, Calvinists became fierce organizers. They channeled all that immense religious energy into dominating culture and politics, aggressively working to build a visible, hyper-organized kingdom right here, right now. Which leads us perfectly into our final section, Section 6, Birth of the Work Ethic, and Wealth as Virtue. Okay, remember, for the Calvinist, you are predestined. You cannot change your fate. But human nature being what it is, everyone still desperately wanted to know, am I one of the chosen? The answer they came up with literally changed the world. They decided that external success actually guarantees salvation. It's the visible proof of God's favor. Under the Calvinist view, work requires strict self-discipline and duty. It doesn't bring personal perfection, but it serves the utility of the community and demonstrates submission to God. Suddenly, making money wasn't something to be suspicious of. It became a divine mandate. The harder you worked, the more successful you were, the clearer it was that God favored you. When we look at this evolution side by side, it is wild to see how our concept of practical wisdom completely shifted over just a few centuries. We started with the monastic paradigm, completely detached from the world, relying on a visible hierarchy and free cooperation with grace. Then we moved to the Lutheran view, passive acceptance of work, an invisible hidden church and internal faith alone. And finally, we arrive at the Calvinist paradigm. Work becomes a utilitarian duty. The church is a coercive theocracy, and salvation is predestined but proven by success. This progression effectively replaced the classical idea of practical wisdom, making ethical choices for human flourishing, with pure, measurable efficiency and economic output. So here's a provocative thought to leave you with. How much of our modern obsession with productivity is just a secular echo of 16th century Calvinist anxiety? Next time you feel guilty for not hustling hard enough, or you kind of catch yourself equating your personal worth with your economic output, just remember, you might be following a 500-year-old theological blueprint. We've stripped away the religious language today, for sure, but that relentless drive for external success as a metric of our inherent value, that is still fully intact. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the origins of the things we take for granted, and I will catch you next time.